I'm not crying. Because I would hate for you to think that what I'm about to say is based on emotion. But you, sir, are a baboon!
Me?
Yes, you! Baboon, 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 baboon!
I don't think you realize what you're saying.
Baboon!
The Simpsons. Hello, and welcome to The Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons to trace the creative evolution of the series and count down, finding the exact moment in which it began its inevitable decline. I'm Erix Antoine, and this week I'm joined by my good friend Josh Fein. We'll be discussing the episode Lisa's Substitute, which originally aired in the U.S. on April 25th, 1991. In this episode, Lisa's teacher, Miss Hoover, takes medical leave due to Lyme disease, so substitute teacher Mr. Bergstrom takes over the class. Lisa finds Mr. Bergstrom charming and inspiring and develops a strong crush. He also is filling a father figure role that should be taken by Homer, and this, of course, leads to conflict. Meanwhile, Bart runs for class president against Martin, and the results are not unlike those of the U.S.'s own 2016 election, depending on what side you are on. This episode presents a very sweet coming-of-age story, which really fleshes out the character of Lisa. It also provides a fun guest role for Dustin Hoffman, who really brings Mr. Bergstrom to life. And more than ever, the guiding hand of James L. Brooks is unmistakable, in that this is a love story with lots of laughs, but an ultimately tear-jerking ending that is still considered one of The Simpsons' sweetest moments. Josh and I are about to break it all down, so without further ado, here we go. Welcome back, Josh. How you doing?
Well, we're dealing with a short but intense heat wave, so it's pretty much staying indoors and avoiding the sun as best I can. And thankfully, this heat wave is supposed to wrap up tomorrow. I kid you not, I actually got hit with jury duty. I got a notice in the mail that I'm supposed to report for jury duty in 2 weeks. Now, obviously, I knew this day would come, but I can't imagine under these circumstances how it's going to work out. Yeah, feel free to insert a lazy Pauly Shore joke.
Yeah, or just something from Jury Duty the Comedy, which is it's a TV movie from like the late 80s with Bronson Pinchot.
Sunday, it's Balky's day for foreplay. He's a crook and a sex machine, plus a schnook and a beauty queen. They're all Bronson Pinchot and Jury Duty the Comedy. Sunday.
This was interesting, and I wanted to lead off with this because in previous episodes you had talked about how The Simpsons had jumped the gorge in terms of being more of a comedy show versus than a family an animated family sitcom.
Right.
It's interesting. This is actually talked about by John Vitti. This episode was controversial at the time because the staff was already getting tired of these more emotional episodes, these, as Vitti put it, these love stories, and that there was a more desire to go do more comedic episodes. And interestingly, as we've talked about before about the hand of James L. Brooks, this episode in particular, at least according to Wikipedia, states that it is the episode that James L. Brooks had the heaviest hand in, to the link that he went to record and direct Dustin Hoffman in New York to get his audio for the episode. Yeah,
that does not, it should not surprise anyone. And I think if you had the heaviest hand in it, and you really do, this feels like the most James L. Brooks episode.
Oh yes.
It's so James L. Brooks, and it's in the story structure, where when you were saying it was written by John Vitti, but I think it was heavily rewritten by James L. Brooks because so much of it is just like the entire third act essentially feels like it was rewritten.
One of the most touching things of the show, and to me, this, it's not. I don't usually get misty-eyed or emotional at a lot of things, but for me, it's always about the little things, little gestures. And this thing with "You Are Lisa Simpson" and the farewell to train always gets me. Would you call that manipulative? Sure. I mean, it's of course it is, but it's well earned in my opinion. To me, I think the other reason to go in these more comedic direction, I think, is the fact that if you're gonna have a show going to the status quo, always reset to the status quo, you're not going to be able to have those emotional impacts unless you allow the characters to adapt and change. Because that kind of emotion comes from those changes and disruptions and encounters. And to me, it's if you're not allowing the characters to grow or age or do anything, and again, you're going back to status quo, you can only be emotional so many times before it loses all impact. And what I'll say finally about this is that because the show decided to become more comedic, this is one of the rare moments where you have really impactful emotion in an episode. And it's something that you don't see the show really do again, and it even has more impact, I think, as a result of it.
Because the way the show is designed, you can't really have character growth. You can't have arcs or anything like that go over like an entire season or whatever. So you're reduced to essentially each episode has to be a self-contained story, and that's their design. But I do think that within, like, you need to be able to take each episode as an individual piece and just on its own terms, sort of. But if it's a well-constructed story, whatever the emotional elements are, I think can work, as long as you look at it as if it were a short film. It's going to have a beginning, middle, and end, and just like it resolves its own things within its 22-minute time frame. And so, like, I think, for instance, this story is very much about it's a nice little coming of age story for Lisa, and then on top of that, the love story aspect, the bonding with her substitute teacher, because ultimately it's about her lack of a father figure. In the end, Homer's there, but he's not really there. He's not really present in her life. And even though this episode sort of, it doesn't seem to have repercussions later. They don't make any more references to the Dustin Hoffman character. Was it Mr. Bergstrom?
Right.
But I do think that thematic elements do carry over, because you do see future episodes that are all about Homer trying to bond with Lisa in some way. Mm-hmm. And either failing to do so or succeeding or whatever it is. But they do touch on the theme. So I think you can have continuity of theme without necessarily having continuity of character. I think that at some point, they just resign themselves to saying, well, the characters aren't going to change. They're sort of going to be frozen in time. But we can carry over themes and explore those themes. And I guess that's how they do it.
No, that's an excellent way of thinking about it. I think what you talked about in terms of viewing each episode as its own individual short film, that's the way I always thought about with comics, because these are stories that have been characters are going on for decades and that will not end. A superhero dies in a comic, well, that character is going to come back at some point. So the best thing to do is, as you said, look at the individual stories or the individual arcs, or the collected story in a trade paperback, that type of thing. But this episode I wanted to discuss, as I said at the beginning, about those emotional reasons. And I think there's also some good comedy, because I'd completely forgotten about the B story in this, where Bart runs against Martin for school president, or class president, rather. A meaningless position. The class president has no power. So they hear Martin talk about, daily asbestos counts. He's way overachieving for what this position means.
We nominate Bart Simpson. Speech! Speech!
I had a speech ready, but my dog ate it.
Children!
But I liked how, at the end of this, the reason Bart lost is because everyone liked it, but no one bothered to vote. And
right.
There are instances, I can only speak to what goes on in this country, but there are many instances of where people think that their movements that are based on the youth are going to take off, and it does not happen at all. At least from my understanding, and admittedly this could be a bit reductive, it's actually kind of what happened with Bernie Sanders this year. One of the many things was that all these young people were going to his rallies, and then he completely got throttled in the primaries, because all those people that perhaps liked him as as an article, as an icon, as a cachet, didn't bother to vote for him. That's my my thought on that. But going back to the main story here, it begins with the Mrs. Hoover. She comes down with Lyme disease, and a disease I think that was widely discussed at the time. It's a serious thing.
It is.
But periodically, it's one of those national issues that gets thrown around like especially in the 90s, you had Lyme disease, then killer bees, then Y2K. It's just something to keep again, these were all serious, but the absolute fear put into people about these things, even though you were nowhere near, I never lived in the woods or near woods, and I was concerned about Lyme disease, although I always get leery about when I go by tall grass. It's just one of those things that you hear about, and this is somehow now a thing.
That whole thing, the Lyme disease scare, I remember, and it still happens today. It hasn't gone away. I mean, they started talking about it back then. There was the whole thing, because of ticks, and they carry Lyme disease. So I've never had an experience with a tick. It's never happened to me, because, again, I grew up in the city, and I was just never in an area where there were a lot of ticks. But and it wasn't even until recently that I was even. I went with some friends of mine upstate New York. Went up to Woodstock to stay in a cabin for 4th of July weekend. This is about going on about a year ago or so, a year and a half ago. And I'm there to say, you got to be careful for ticks. You got to stay out of tall grass. And I was like, oh really, tick? Yeah, I mean, because they might give you Lyme disease. It's just it's still it's still an issue. It's still a thing.
It is.
It is. But strangely enough, I mean, and it's apparently a really bad thing. I know somebody who had it, and she eventually, I guess, recovered. But I think it's something that sort of stays with you.
Yes.
So I understand that it never totally goes away. You basically have to. It becomes this chronic thing that you have to be in treatment for your whole life.
Right. It's like shingles, or any number of chronic diseases that you have to manage, and. So Mrs. Hoover, goes off, and then the class has to deal with, Principal Skinner teaching the class for about 5 seconds, and then Mr. Bergstrom comes in firing cap guns in a school. Obviously, you can't have that now.
No.
Frightening Principal Skinner, possible Nam flashback that he had that we later discovered with him being a Vietnam veteran, and you can see, he's not like Mr. Bergstrom is not like any other teacher. I also kind of liken this episode to that run of, that one teacher, like your Dead Poets Society, your Stand and Deliver, your Lean on Me, that one school administrator, that one teacher who turns it all around. And it was that was that time frame when you had all those movies. And Mr. Bergstrom comes in dressed like a cowboy and quizzes everybody, and Lisa is immediately smitten.
There are 3 things wrong with my costume.
1, your belt buckle says state of Texas, but Texas wasn't a state until 1845.
Very good.
2, the revolver wasn't invented until 1835.
That's excellent.
3, you seem to be of the Jewish faith.
Are you sure I'm Jewish?
Or Italian.
I'm Jewish.
And there weren't any Jewish cowboys.
Many of us can have that experience of that teacher that made an impression on you. I think that, you have negative impressions and you have positive impressions, right? But I think that they do stay with you. People don't maybe think about it all the time, but yeah, I think that it's a noble profession because of that, because I think you have the possibility of really impacting someone's life, depending on how you hit them, how it, at what point you're there for them,
Did you ever have an instance where with a class you had a teacher that was there and then just disappeared, and then you just had a substitute for weeks, or effectively that's who you had for the rest of the year?
No, nothing quite like that I can think of. I do have the experience of, this is middle school, but yeah, it would have been 8th grade, and I quite admired and liked my social studies teacher. His name was Mr. Aronson, and he'd been social studies teacher in 7th grade. He'd been my social studies teacher in 8th grade, and at some point he left for whatever reason. I didn't know the details, but he left, and then the person who came in, whose name I don't remember, turned out to be a real asshole. So it was, go from a teacher that I liked and respected and liked the teaching style and all that, but this new guy that came in was just like a dude bro douchebag, and just like, and so I remember that being like, oh God, go from Mr. Aronson to this. I hated him. But that's the only thing that I can recall being a particular, like that sort of thing, like what you're saying, where I have a teacher that I really liked, and then all of a sudden the teacher was gone. And then, I have like two specific memories. Like, and in my case, it was not like Lisa Simpson. It's not like I had a crush on this teacher, but I remember two of my elementary school teachers. I kind of remember them all, one way or another, and I even like most of them, and I even remember their names. But like in this particular case, these really stuck out. Like, I remember my second grade teacher, Mrs. Molnick. And the reason I remember her is because she kind of looked like Nancy Reagan. And she would do this thing, like when she would get mad, she would like put her hands around like your ears and scream in your face. Yeah, I remember like she would like cup her hands around like my ears and just like scream in my face. And so that always stayed with me. Like, what a weird, I think that counts as abuse. I should have said something about that, but I didn't. And
was she
then
yelling like the creature in the Aphex Twin video? Was it like that, or more just like,
Well, I mean, to an 8-year-old, I suppose it would have been.
that would have been horrifying. Yeah.
And then my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Sapero, I remember her because at the time she was like my favorite teacher. I was fifth grade, and she's the one who like she was really into reading, and around that time, I mean, she was very much about that, and around that time, I had gotten into Stephen King, and I would bring the books to class, and she noticed I was reading. I think it was at the time, I guess it would have been The Shining. I don't know, and she remarked, she said, "Your parents let you read those books?" And I was like, "Sure, yeah." And it's okay. And then she, she said that she really liked Stephen King and everything. We actually started talking about Stephen King and I remember I lent her my books, and so we had a little like we would exchange books. I'd lend her a book, and then she'd say, "You should read this book." Once she realized that my parents they were okay with me reading quote unquote adult literature. I guess she figured, well, if his parents are okay with it, then it's not a problem. So that was kind of fun. I remember that. So those things that stayed with me.
That's lovely. That really is. And I think, as you said, that is one of those moments, I think, where, that again, the role of the teacher is a critical one, because he could certainly encourage you in certain subjects and turn you off to certain subjects based on the personality of the teacher. Like my day job is in the accounting field, and I had a terrible accounting instructor in college that turned me off to the field. It's just a subject that isn't taught very well. And and so it just becomes a miserable experience for anyone that goes through it. And then when I did some like self-study work with this, this course that I bought, and it's taught by this really energetic, guy who's basically been doing it for 30 some odd years. And it's like, oh, and he was able to explain it in such a way. It's like, oh, okay, now I finally understand it. And it's a critical thing. And it's not an easy, it's definitely a position I think that shouldn't be taken lightly, just because of the impact you can have, and especially if you happen to be you're a shambling burnout or something like that, you can do a lot of irreparable damage, and you're not thinking about that. And because we see that, I think with Krabappel and Hoover, the more traditional, like again, they're just watching the clock and wait till 3 p.m. and then it's a more cynical view of how teachers act, and I think from the writers and also their experiences with their teachers. But this is a charming guy, and I think that's due to Dustin Hoffman. Perhaps it's a continuation of what I mentioned before with the flashback episode, is that this was the rise of the intellectual, well, in this case, Bergstrom's not nebbish, but the not macho looking man, but that also is just charming as hell with the ladies. And in fact,
right,
they effortlessly, I think, put in that reference.
So, while I'm technically still married, there really hasn't been any marriage to speak of since Mr. Krabappel moved into his little love net.
Mrs. Krabappel, you're trying to seduce me.
I do want to talk about the scenes of Homer and Lisa. After they, Homer goes to they go to the Museum of Natural History, which is going to close in 2 weeks due to a lack of interest. I thought that was a good line. And again, as we said before, that Lisa is definitely having a crush on Mr. Bergstrom, possibly even smitten. And Mr. Bergstrom could tell because, I mean, he already heard that before when Lisa mentions his Semitic good looks, and then she goes to hold his hand, and he's quite taken aback by that. So he knows, and Homer's there, and he's not doing much of a job, really much of a job being a father figure. And so, Bergstrom knows that he's got to bring this up with Homer, that he's not going to be there for long. And it's, perhaps maybe Bergstrom's encountered this before. You could tell that obviously, Bergstrom cares about Lisa and cares about his students. And I think that's why he's encouraging him, Homer, that, you gotta step up here. And I thought it was interesting that when you have the scene after Mr. Bergstrom leaves and Lisa has an outburst at the dinner table, I mean, her heart's broken. And it's really sad, and Homer in his way, he knows what I think Lisa's dealing with, but he can't necessarily articulate it. So he has to articulate it as best he can. And it's, it's a very heartfelt moment. Again, he's doing it in his own way.
Just wish I knew what to say. Although maybe this music will help. Now, you lost someone special and it hurts. I'm lucky because I never lost anyone special to me. Everyone special to me is under this roof. It's true. Now, you'll have lots of special people in your life, Lisa. There's probably some place where they all get together and the food is real good and guys like me are serving drinks.
If people look back on this episode, they tend to remember just the substitute thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they tend to remember that it ends with the substitute leaving and with, that letter that says, "You are Lisa Simpson." And they tend to forget that there's still a huge chunk of the episode left. A pretty significant amount of time still goes. People tend to forget the actual ending of the episode, which is Homer's realization. And that's actually my favorite part of the episode. Like, I think that, and maybe that's because as a parent, as a father of a daughter, I can sort of identify with that. I mean, I'm not an oaf like Homer Simpson is, but the idea of, you want to connect, and you want to be a positive influence and a positive father figure for your child, right? And you also have an understanding that as a human being, you're imperfect. And I think that the self-awareness that he displays in this episode is very interesting, because you go from the scene in the dinner table where she breaks down. That whole part of it, I think, is very. I think that actually makes the episode, but people tend to forget about that for some reason. They tend to always focus on just the substitute teacher angle, which, I mean, yes, it's there, but the episode is really about that. It's really about Homer and Lisa sort of connecting on that level. Lisa discovering that Homer can be her dad, her father figure, even though he is imperfect, even though he's not erudite or, he's not Mr. Bergstrom, but he is her dad and he does love her. And that element of it, I think, is her realization is what this episode is really about.
Yeah, the ending is wonderful because he reconciles with Lisa, then he has a scene with Bart.
Would you have gotten any money for being class president?
No.
Would you have to do extra work?
Yeah.
And is this Martin guy going to get to do anything neat? Like throw out the first ball at the World Series? Huh?
Well, no.
So let the baby have his bottle. Huh? That's my model.
Oh. Hey, thanks, Monkey Man.
Let's talk about that subplot for a minute, because you brought it up earlier. You made a comparison with Bernie Sanders,
mm-hmm.
and I agree with you. And I think that the one thing that is kind of key is that subplot is actually pretty funny, like pretty prescient in a way as to the reality of an election. Like it touches on something that, I mean, an election is a popularity contest in a certain way. It just is. To some degree, there's that aspect to it, right? I mean, obviously, we want to believe that there's more to it than that, and there is. But there's a huge aspect of it that is reduced to a popularity contest, and especially I think with the way things are now, that so much of it is happening on social media. We're at a level 30 years later where things are a little bit different and confusing in that aspect, where you're just not sure, because like you'll be seeing certain things on social media, the way that you are, you'll have conversations outside of it with other people, and you'll have a certain impression. You watch the news, you get another impression. But what happens to Bart, I couldn't help it. I mean, it made me think of the 2016 election. Even though like they were doing a parody of which election was it? Where like
the 1948 election. Let me add to this because Martin holds up the Bart defeats Martin. That's a parody of Dewey defeats Truman.
Right.
Truman was the underdog. I want to mention something. It's something that has always been the case, and this is one of these things that always gets bothers me when like someone says, "Well, The Simpsons predicted X," and that's not true. I can remember as far as I've been alive. And as far as 18-year-olds have been allowed to vote, there have always been news stories about, will this be the election that the youth decide to get out and vote for X candidate, or X candidate is betting on capturing and galvanizing the youth vote, and it never works. There's always been stats of older people turn out to vote, which is, unfortunately what, one of the things in 2016. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on that, but older people vote, and young people don't have the habit of voting. So it's very difficult. And again, I can only speak to how it goes in this country, that to build a movement where you're going to say you're going to, activate new voters, it's a very difficult thing to do. And it's nearly impossible. I think the most recent example where it worked was Obama in 2008. It was the first African-American candidate, and it was a break from the Clintons. And, this was something different. This was something important. So, and I agree with you. Our election's a popularity contest. Yeah, I think there are many instances of like, there was the classic thing when George W. Bush was running, and it was the average, the line was like, here's the guy that you want to have a beer with. Yeah, there are people that just vote for somebody because they just find that person more likable. It doesn't necessarily, it's not about the issues. You like to think it's about the issues, but yeah, it can be much more surface level, and it is. They levied that was levied against Clinton in '92. It's like, here's Slick Willie being a charming bastard, and
yep,
he's the guy that feels your pain, that's empathetic. And
he went on Arsenio and played the saxophone.
Played
you know
sax,
what I mean? So that's the thing.
About, smoking a joint, but he didn't inhale.
Yeah,
sure.
Which like,
but
right, yeah, of course.
We've
all seen that postcard.
Yeah, and it's just the elections have been that way. I mean, there were times where, people, I mean, if you go back far enough, candidates would just sit on their front porch, and other people would speak for them, and they would never leave their house. There are times where, liking a candidate becomes more of it's more of, again, iconography than actually backing the guy. And the thing is, I don't want to belittle people that believed in, Bernie Sanders. There are people that truly believed in him, and they voted for him. But there are people that just, they made him a cult of personality, and people didn't go out. Those people didn't. They attended his rallies because they said they could go there, but they just didn't get out and actually vote for the man.
I demand a recount.
1 for Martin, 2 for Martin. Would you like another recount?
No.
Well, I just want to make sure. 1 for Martin, 2 for Martin.
Actually, one thing about it that this brought to mind as well, we talk about, they go to the Museum of Natural History, and when Lisa goes looking for Mr. Bergstrom at that apartment house that it seems to be like a tenement building or something. Yeah. And so you go like, what kind of a city is Springfield? Like you go, because, presumably it's like a Midwestern small town. It's not a capital city. It's, they never named the state, but, we can assume that it's somewhere in the Midwest, so it can be anything. But they have like a museum of natural history, and then you go like try to make try to relate it to something. I mean, I'm not too familiar with that, but it's like, I would think that Springfield, if I make the relationship to like, let's say New York, I would think that Springfield is, like one of those towns upstate, or one of those, just something in Long Island or whatever, that's what it is. And then, so the Museum of Natural History, quote unquote, is in the city. It's in Midtown Manhattan. That's where it is. That, well, it's actually uptown. but that's, it's not in Hicksville, you know what I mean? Or like there is no museum of natural history there. There is no tenement building. It's just suburbs. And that's usually how it is in small towns. That's the part that makes it so confusing, that not confusing, but it's just funny that like Springfield is whatever it needs to be for the writers. Like it is whatever it needs to be for the purposes of the show. So sometimes, yes, it can have a museum of natural history and a tenement area and a Lower East Side, as we will find out later when talking, when in Krusty's episode where he talks about his upbringing, in the Jewish neighborhood of the Lower East Side of Springfield. So all of those things are just that's funny to me. How like we're already at a point where they've created this world in Springfield that is malleable. There's no real consistency. It's whatever it needs to be. It's primarily a small town, but when it needs to be more than that, it is more than that, and they don't care. Like there's no, it doesn't matter. Just tell the story that you need to tell.
Oh yeah. I would say that the Happy Gypsy could be even like a single room occupancy hotel, one of those flop houses that you would see in like old film noirs or depressing films from the 70s where the bathroom's down the hall and the payphone's outside. But yeah, I agree with you that the town, I mean, at best, maybe you could say it's like a small city. You mentioned upstate New York. I mean, would you think that it would be like a Rochester or Syracuse or my family's from New York, but I've never been to upstate New York. Maybe it's like a city of like 100,000 people. But as you said, because it's not based anywhere. The geography could be anything it wants to be. So obviously, they could put anything they want where. I mean, in a future episode, we have the Two Guys from Kabul restaurant. So in Springfield, you could get Afghani food, or as you said, a Lower East Side, a Jewish neighborhood. Yeah, it's just there's never consistency to it. Again, as you said, going back to what you said at the top, every episode is almost like a short film. So like in this instance, we can depict the Simpsons this way. And then in another instance, we could have an episode, where cutting the head off the statue is such an incident for the town that everybody rises up. And that also that the town will routinely gather into mobs when they need to. But I think, to sum it all up, it's got to be more of a small town or like a small city, because you have to have people knowing each other, and you can only have like one of one thing. You have one convenience store, you have one police station, you have one bar that mainly one bar. There are a couple of bars that Homer tries to go to.
Yes.
Later on in other episodes. I mean, if you want to liken it to, obviously geography isn't the same as like there's a Springfield, Massachusetts, which is in the western part of the state. And then if you go east, there's Boston.
I've never been to Springfield, Massachusetts, but I used to spend a lot of time in Framingham, Massachusetts. And I can tell you, I mean, Framingham, it had malls. It had some restaurants, had some Friendlies, had some Brighams, had things like that, and had a bunch of communities, suburbs and things like that. But yeah, there was no Museum of Natural History. It's funny to me, but it's okay. It's not a problem. It's just funny to me.
You see, class, my Lyme disease turned out to be psychosomatic.
Does that mean you're crazy? No, that means she was faking it.
No, actually, it was a little of both.
Dustin Hoffman is really good in this episode. He does not use his name, which is something I think we're not going to see this anymore. Like after Michael Jackson does it at the beginning of season 3, from that point on, everybody just uses their names. And right. And it seems to be for SAG purposes.
I believe that, to be quite honest. I think that sounds about right. It's not something I've ever heard from the showrunners, but I doubt they would ever go into that detail. It's like the only thing you get from the show is that we insist on everyone, if you want to be on the show, you have to use your own name. And,
right.
But this was still the era of where you would have these celebrities usually play characters. They don't play themselves. And
right.
That becomes far less as the show goes on. It becomes much more like, gimmick heavy with its celebrities.
Yeah. I mean, you'll still get occasional situations where you have an actor coming in and playing a character. Like, Paul Newman eventually does it. Like, it'll happen. But yeah, it's more frequent to just have big stars come in and cameo as themselves.
You can't go. You're the best teacher I'll ever have.
Oh, that's not true. Other teachers will come along.
Oh, please.
No, I can't lie to you. I am the best. But, you know, they need me over in the projects of Capital City.
But I need you too.
That's the problem with being middle class. Anybody who really cares will abandon you for those who need it more.
All right, so the final word on the episode is that it's good. It's very well written, very well acted. Yeardly Smith and Dustin Hoffman both give very good performances. Yeardly Smith really gets to tap into Lisa. He really gets to flesh out the character. She gets some very nice emotional scenes to work with. And yes, you have the heavy hand of James L. Brooks. Well, I mean, it's not that it's heavy-handed. That's a bad way of putting it. But his influence. Yes, you have the significant influence of James L. Brooks, very evident throughout the episode, especially at the end. And you have an episode that is a classic now, and rightfully so. It's a good piece of entertainment. We're still, yes, we jumped the gorge, but we're still occasionally getting episodes like this where this is an episode that, there's going to come a point where this sentimentality is going to sort of get filtered out, and it will become less and less evident in coming seasons. And we're going to get a couple, but it's not going to be as frequent as it has been. So it is just kind of interesting to see how the show evolved. And so here they were still trying out. And even like the writers themselves, you're saying they were getting tired of these sort of, emotional episodes, and they wanted to do more wacky comedy. And you can definitely tell when you look at the episodes that surround this film. But, I can own up to it, making me, quote unquote, cry. I mean, not cry, but, I got the lump in my throat, I got that. And it like works. And I mean, I've said this before, I am an easy mark for schmaltz. This shit works on me. So,
yeah, but I think it's something that's real difficult to pull off because it's so easy to fall into parody. And it's so easy to make fun of. I honestly think that, that's what I said before. I think it's when it's these little gestures, I think they have more impact because you don't expect it. It's not telegraphed, and it's allowed to stand on its own. It's not some guy screaming "I love you" at the airport at the end of a romantic comedy. We've seen that.
All right, well, this was a good talk, as usual. And you'll be back next season.
Yes.
There's a bunch of stuff coming.
And I plan to probably do something a little more slight or lighthearted.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think that we're going to get that opportunity just because the episodes start becoming a lot wackier and less sentimental anyway. So,
I mean, get ready. I'm going to still cover a couple of emotional episodes from season 3 that I have my eye on. Yeah, I'm going to, don't worry, for the listeners, I'm going to definitely change gears. Just we're going to get there, regardless. As the episodes go on.
All right, so you take care of yourself.
You take care as well.
So that's it for this week's installment of The Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please give us a like. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Anchor FM, and other podcasting platforms. A brief review might actually help boost the podcast's profile, so by all means feel free. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends on social media. I'm Erix Antoine. I'll be back next Thursday evening to talk about The War of the Simpsons, in which Homer and Marge experience marital strife once again, and must head to a couples retreat and hopefully fix things. My good friend Jason Pollock will be here to discuss that, and I hope you'll join us. Until then, stay safe out there, continue observing your biosafety and social distancing protocols, because whether your area is opening up or not, we are not quite through this thing, and we need everyone to do their part keeping themselves and everyone else healthy, and we'll get through this in due time. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
Lyme disease is a very complex disease. So when it's transmitted by a tick bite, and a tick is a carrier, so when you get tick bite, you don't just get Lyme disease, you can get other...